Well, welcome everybody. It's great to have so many of you with us, and we've got a fantastic lineup here today in this uh, webinar where we're looking at the risks of nuclear from a bit from the Far North Queensland perspective. And I'd just like to start with acknowledging that each of us are on, if we're in Australia, we're each on Aboriginal territory, and that territory that we're on has been held in the hands of Aboriginal people for thousands of years, and that the elders from those lands are still with us, and the young people are coming up. The young elders or the elders in formation are coming up, and I just want to acknowledge their leadership and their presence. And I'd like to welcome anybody who is from First Nations territory who's amongst us, and just acknowledge and thank you for your presence. And I also, if you're in Cairns, you're on Yidinji country, and to the north, Yirrakanji country, and the neighbouring tribes, the Mamu in the south, and Kuki-Yalanji to the north, and the Jabbergai to the west, and just acknowledging that whole set of tribes who really fought as hard as they could against the violent and harsh colonisation that occurred in the 1870s and 1880s, 1890s, right up till the 1920s, actually, and to this day. So I just want to acknowledge those people. I'm currently on Yagara territory here in Brisbane, but I also want to just do a shout out to the Aboriginal people, and just remembering that Aboriginal people have fought against nuclear industry, the nuclear industry. There's been 5 wins in the South Australian Northern Territory area, stopping waste dumps. There's been a number of wins against the uranium industry, and each time we've had Aboriginal people at the forefront of those struggles with some magnificent wins. And I just want to acknowledge those people and remember that we work inside their aspirations and we work alongside them. And this has been a long struggle for them, more than 100 years long. And so just want to acknowledge that and keep that in the forefront of our minds as we listen to these awesome speakers. So passing over to my friend Monique.
Hi, Ron. Yeah, I'm Monique. Many of you probably know me from CAFNEC, Cairns Far North Environment Centre, and I'm just co-emceeing tonight with Margie. I just wanted to quickly do some housekeeping. Lots of you have already done it, introducing yourself in the chat, letting us know, what country, Aboriginal territories you're calling in from. I just want to acknowledge that I'm here on Gimoy Wallabara Yidinji and Yirrakanji country. And yeah, we're recording the meeting. You probably got a little notification, so we'll record this and be able to publish it so that people who couldn't make it tonight can watch and catch up. If you can keep yourself muted unless it's in the times where we're talking, and if you feel comfortable having your video on for most of the chat, it's lovely for the presenters to be able to see who's around and us to see each other, even though it's online. We're going to have 4 wonderful speakers, and in between those speakers, there'll be time for questions or reflections. We'll be keeping the chat paused when speakers are sharing, just so that we can all really listen and absorb what we're hearing. But once the speaker's finished, we'll open the chat back up so you can share any reflections or thoughts. You can also use the raise hand function if you want to speak, and we'll use that to keep an eye on who wants to share, so that Margie and I can, sort of keep it somewhat structured. But yeah, we want to hear people's thoughts and reflections. And if you want to stay in touch and haven't RSVP'd already, make sure you can just send your email to Sarah in the chat. I think that's all of the housekeeping. Really wonderful to have you all here. I'll hand back to Margie to introduce our first speaker.
And if you can just say your name in the chat and what territory you're on, that'd be great too. We are going to pause the chat for the speakers so there's not too much interruption. And but yeah, so I'd just like to really welcome our four speakers, and starting with tonight with Dr. Margaret Beavis, who is formerly a GP, and Margaret now teaches in the medical faculty at Melbourne University and has lectured on nuclear issues to the Masters of Public Health students. She's also Vice President of the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, which is a major peace and anti-militarism organisation in Australia. So we really welcome, Margaret's going to talk to us about the health implications in this, webinar where we're looking at the risks of the nuclear industry in Australia. Welcome, Margie.
Thanks, Maggie. Thanks for that kind introduction. I also would like to acknowledge the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, their elders that have looked after this land for generations without messing it up, and also acknowledge the considerable and ongoing health impacts of colonisation. Okay, so when it comes to health, the Coalition's nuclear plan has problems on just so many levels. There are so many issues. The nuclear lobby reminds me a lot of big tobacco, where a lot of money was spent to convince people everything was just fine and dandy with their product. I'm going to talk about the real world health impacts on workers and communities, and also the national impacts, which is where Far North Queensland, I think, will be most impacted. We know radiation causes damage to living cells, particularly our DNA, which is our genetic material. It's worse for women, and it's much, much worse for kids. We know there's background radiation in everyday life, and also that cancers that are caused by excess radiation look just like every other cancer. What's useful is that in the last few years, there's been a gold standard study called the InWorks study, which looked at over 300,000 radiation workers and measured how much radiation they were getting, and also kept studying them to an average age of 70, so that the delayed health problems had time to show up. This was really useful because it actually showed that there were indeed increased cancers, but also, surprisingly, increased heart attacks and strokes for these workers. It also clearly showed there is no such thing as a safe lower limit. The sales pitch you'll get from the nuclear folks is that radiation is harmless. But if radiation is harmless, why every time you go for an X-ray is there a big sign saying, if you're pregnant, please tell us? And the reason that is because we've known since the 1950s that radiation for unborn babies is pretty terrible. It increases the risk of leukemia and stroke. And in fact, there's been concerns about leukemia and cancer, not stroke. There's been concerns about leukemia in children for decades. And this was first picked up in the 1980s when they noticed around the Sellafield reactor in England. So the UK government thought, we'll fix that. So they did a big inquiry and actually found that, yes, indeed, there was increased leukemia around the Sellafield plant. In 2007, the US government, the Department of Energy, examined all the reliable research globally and also confirmed a significant increase in leukemia for children living near nuclear power plants. If you want to look at the clearest findings on this subject, there's a large national German study which looked at kids within 5 kilometres for the 16 operating nuclear power plants there, and studied this for over 25 years. And that indeed showed that it was more than double the incidence of leukemia for kids living within 5 kilometres of a nuclear power plant. And that if you looked at the risk graph, it didn't go back to a normal level of leukemia until you were more than 50 kilometres away from the nuclear power plant. So I know North Queensland isn't actually getting a nuclear power plant, but still climate change is where the biggest concern would be for North Queensland. The Coalition plan massively prolongs coal and gas usage, and using their own modelling, it almost triples emissions between now and 2050, and that is with their wildly optimistic timelines. If you look at the UK, the US and France, who are comparable countries, although they have a lot of experience in nuclear technology, these timelines are nonsense. The delays in building these reactors is huge. And with delays, the increase in emissions will be much more. Climate change is bad enough already, but this policy will give us worse floods, worse bushfires, worse cyclones, worse heat waves, and worse droughts. And all of these have major health impacts, especially on regional and remote communities. And don't forget that nuclear power plants themselves are vulnerable to these major weather events. The next question is water. Nuclear reactors use much, much more water than renewables. And as our planet continues to heat, water insecurity is increasingly becoming a serious public health problem. If someone's enthusiastic about nuclear, ask them, when future droughts happen, will cooling the reactors be prioritised over the needs of the local people, agriculture and nature? The next concern, and there are so many, is nuclear accidents. Again, to the real world, if nuclear reactors are so safe, why is it always the taxpayer that has to underwrite the commercial insurance? Because no commercial insurer will cover for the risk of a catastrophic accident. And if they are so safe, why does every home insurance policy across Australia say they will not cover for damage from nuclear accidents? Complex technology systems all fail at some point, and nuclear reactors are no exception. The best known accidents we know of are Windscale, Chernobyl, Three Mile Island and Fukushima, but there have been at least 20 involving fuel or reactor core damages, and there have been many, many near misses. It's worth thinking about Fukushima. More than 10 years later, the reactor is still leaking and dangerous, and lots of contaminated water is still being dumped into the Pacific Ocean. The former Prime Minister of Japan, Naoto Kan, said it was just dumb luck, or he didn't use those words, but that there was a real possibility of needing to evacuate Tokyo. And in fact, it was a question of prevailing winds and the fact there wasn't precipitation, that they didn't have to evacuate Tokyo. If you can imagine evacuating 35 million people. It's wind direction that determines where the radiation goes. And Jim Green, who's fortunately speaking later, will tell you all about nuclearplume.au, which maps the fallout zones from Fukushima for the reactors in Australia, looking at the wind directions and who would actually be contaminated in an accident. The Khalid reactor would be less than 1,000 kilometres from Cairns. It's worth remembering that for Chernobyl, North Wales was more than twice that distance away, but the uplands were still contaminated by that disaster. It's also worth remembering that back in 2007, when nuclear was a live option, the modelling by the Australia Institute said that additional sites for nuclear power plants could be Townsville, Mackay, Rockhampton and Bundaberg. Heaven forbid that actually happens. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group, which includes Australian Defence Force Chief Chris Barry, warning that the coalition's nuclear plan could leave Australia vulnerable to devastating attacks. And these days, cyber attacks using AI or sabotage or drones are all possible and not nearly as difficult as previously. It only takes disrupting the power of the cooling water to supply the reactors for a few minutes, and even the supply to the cooling ponds, to cause a meltdown and or an explosion. And this could potentially cause extensive, severe radioactive contamination requiring long-term evacuation. And if you think it can't happen here, just know that between 1983 and 2007, there have been multiple threats against the Lucas Heights research reactor, including one where there are explosives and detonators found within the boundary inside an electrical substation. And lastly, but definitely not least, there's the issue of waste. Nuclear power reactors produce highly toxic radioactive waste that needs to be kept safe from the environment for more than 100,000 years. This is a significant health burden, and we're passing it on to our kids and to our children's children and so on, many generations. Remember, the pharaohs in Egypt were only 5,000 years ago. In the real world, there are no high-level waste disposal anywhere. Finland plans to open one next year, but it's taken over 40 years and it hasn't happened yet. Nobody wants this waste, especially not our First Nations people who have been so often targeted. And as Margie noted, they've been looking for a place for our waste, our small amount of waste, which is only intermediate level waste, from the Lucas Heights reactor for over 40 years without success. So, in closing, the next time someone tells you that radiation is harmless, remember the signs in the X-ray clinics. Remember the childhood leukemia. Remember, we now have really clear evidence that there's increased cancers, heart attacks and strokes amongst workers. Remember, there is no such thing as a safe lower limit. Remember that governments and taxpayers and us are the ones that have to cover the insurance, that no insurance company will cover a catastrophic accident and no insurance company will cover your home. Remember to ask, who will get the water in the next drought? And never forget the highly toxic waste, which usually ends up staying at the reactor site for decades, and this increases the risk of accidents. So, in closing, nationally, the biggest issue for all of us in North Queensland, down here in Melbourne, is the climate impacts. Across Australia, this plan would have worse cyclones, worse droughts, worse floods, worse bushfires, worse heat waves. And from a health perspective, this is totally unacceptable. It's a recipe for more disasters and more deaths. The good news is that renewables are here now. They're much safer, they're much cheaper, and they actually do help with addressing climate change. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Margaret. That's very, very in a nutshell. Thank you very much. So we thought we'd have about, we're sort of doing it on a 10-10 sort of basis, but we don't have to use all that time because then we could finish earlier. And we do have 4 very excellent speakers. Karina, I think, hasn't joined us yet, so we might be changing the order up a little bit. But in the meantime, it would be good to hear a couple of reflections or questions. And we're particularly interested in, you know, the application to Far North Queensland. And there's a lot of people who live in Far North Queensland or have lived a long time in Far North Queensland. So it's good to hear those reflections as well. So just short reflections or a couple of questions, and then we'll put that back to Margaret to respond to close around that. Yep. So yeah, you can put your hand using up, there's a react button, and in the react button, well, you can just put anything in the react button, and if you put anything in the react button, I'll assume that means you want to speak. Yeah, Mr. Holland.
Hi, Margie and everyone. I'm just wondering if Margaret or anybody could recap how many nuclear reactors the LNP plan to build and what percentage of the total electricity demands will this fulfill? Because I understand that even, I'm not sure how many, was it 7 reactors? But that would still be a very small proportion of electricity demand.
Jim would probably be better. I've understood it was around 5%, but I also think their modelling, their very problematic modelling, is for a much lower total energy supply. It's about half what the total energy supply is. And I think on both those counts, there are problems. In terms of number of reactors per site, I'm not sure. Jim might be more aware of that detail.
When maybe when Jim speaks, he can respond to that later, Jeff, if that's all right. I'm sure he'll include that.
Or I could answer it right now if you prefer.
Yeah, I'd jump
Maybe.
in. Yep.
Yeah, well, how much power would these nuclear reactors generate? It really is a very difficult one to answer. If we look at the projected total electricity generating capacity in 2050, and if we assumed that the coalition builds the reactors it says it wants to build, then we're talking, say, 5% of overall capacity, and in terms of generation, well, maybe 10 to 15%, something of that order. The coalition claims it will be higher, but they're assuming nuclear operating with a capacity factor of 90%. Well, it's not going to happen in a grid dominated by renewables. So anyway, it's just not an easy one to answer. And in terms of how many reactors they would build at these sites, well, they say multiple reactors at each site, but they haven't been any more specific than that. So we'll just have to wait and see. But that gets us back to one of the safety issues, where when you have multiple reactors at a site, then you can have multiple disasters at one site, either because of some common cause of a nuclear disaster, such as the loss of off-site electricity supply, or, you know, damage to one reactor damaging the adjacent reactors. And we certainly saw that at Fukushima as well. I'll leave it there, Margie.
Thank you. Yeah, so back to Margaret's. So Margaret talked about the health, and the idea of the insurance, the health. You know, insurance is something we already understand quite a lot about in Far North Queensland, as you know. So yeah, is there any other reflections on the meaning of the health? I mean, the thing that would occur to me about Far North Queensland is that we're also already quite a small and stretched community in terms of having a local base hospital. That's a hospital that already services a massive region, along with the Townsville Base Hospital. And yet we have quite a small number of people and quite therefore a small number of staff. So our ability to, respond to, I guess this is an issue for Townsville and Collide or whatever, would be those sorts of issues, our remoteness, I guess. Have you got any thoughts about that, Margaret?
I think for the people much closer to the reactor, the issues then come down to what are you going to do instead of if there is an accident? And what's interesting is that in France, around one of their reactor regions, they recently really increased the number of people being issued with with stable iodine by about 2.2 million, because they recognize that the wind direction is very important where the fallout goes. And with radioactive iodine, if you're going to have any effect, you really need to take it either before the accident, because you can tell an accident's coming, or within 2 hours. And ideally, after 8 hours, it's lost a lot of impact. And after 24 hours, taking radioactive iodine will do more harm than good, because it will increase the length of time that the radioactive iodine that's got into you from the fallout is in your thyroid. So that's only just addressing the risk of thyroid cancer. But it's fascinating when they say this is such a safe industry. Why did the French government suddenly decide to issue 2.2 million people with stable iodine? And whether the people in Townsville are going to be issued with stable iodine is a whole question for the people in Townsville. I mean, it's really interesting to look at the nuclear plume data that Jim put out yesterday on the anniversary of Fukushima, because really there should be some very sobering thoughts about who is going to have radioactive iodine, because you can't just say, oh, we'll issue it when there's an accident, because if it's going to have to be issued so quickly, people actually have to have it in their house, has to be within date, like medicines. I mean, it's a whole can of worms, the sort of safety issues around a nuclear reactor.
Well, if there's no other comments, maybe we'll move on to thank you very much, Margaret. So just there's one moment for somebody else to make another comment about the health issues of that are associated.
I just say, just think about big tobacco. There's a lot of money being spent at the moment to whitewash this industry.
Yeah.
Over the web. I wouldn't mind saying something on that. You know, the question is for regional areas, if we can't get iodine very quickly, you know, within a couple of hours, do we actually need to be, you know, we might go away from our homes for hours. How do we have to carry it in the car?
Yep.
We have to carry it in our picnic bag, you know, just in case. And we can never say never.
Effectively.
Okay, so I don't know anything about that. That's just a completely new area of the iodine question, which I don't know. Never heard anything about
And
it.
that's only protecting you from your thyroid. Doesn't stop any of the other cancers or the leukemias or the other stuff. You know, that's just looking after your thyroid.
Well, we're going to move on to to somebody who knows a lot about health effects. I'm going to pass it on to Monique Jeffs, or these are sort of direct, and you know, we're very lucky and very fortunate to have Karina Lester with us. So just pass on to Monique to make and I'll find you and pin you Karina.
Yeah, we're so privileged to have Karina Lester join us. So she's going to be sharing her family story with us. She is a Yankunytjatjara woman from the Western Desert region in South Australia, and a second-generation survivor of British nuclear tests that took place in her country at Emu Fields on the 15th of October 1953. Karina just recently attended the COP29 as an ambassador for the Nobel Peace Prize winning organisation, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. And she just got back from the third meeting of the states parties to the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the UN headquarters in New York. So very busy, but wonderful that she could join us today. And once again, the chat will just be paused while Karina shares, and then we'll unpause it for people to share reflections afterwards. But Karina, if you're ready, amazing. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Monique, and hope everyone can hear me. Good evening. Can you just bear with me? I've got background noise, so I'll just deal with that.
Yeah,
And the
all good.
background goanna. Welcome, we can hear you well.
Sorry about that. Thank you, everyone, and really grateful for this opportunity. I do want to acknowledge that I am here on Kaurna country, but I'm right up on the APY lands, up on the very location where the ground shook and the black mist rolled. So this evening, I just really wanted to share some of our family story. It's been a generational story, and our many decades of campaigning against nuclear, and this whole new debate and conversation around nuclear power just adds to the story. So I thought I'll just talk a little bit about Dad's story in particular, because I think that's where things really started for me as well. So my late father, Yami Lester, was born on Yankunytjatjara country, and as a young boy witnessed the first mainland test that took place at Emu Field, roughly 160 kilometres south from Walyajarra, which is his traditional lands. And it was there that he and his family, and it was a pastoral property. So he was growing up as a young boy, watching his parents sort of do their work around the station. Nana would have been doing some domestic work around the homestead, washing clothes and cleaning the homestead, helping Mrs. Cullinan, and Dad and his family, like father, would have been doing a lot of work on the station. So that was how the morning kind of started back then on the 15th of October 1953. And then soon after, things changed quite dramatically then, when that first detonation of that Totem 1 took place south from that traditional lands, from Dad's country. And so the old homestead where the house is now today, just roughly maybe a kilometre, 2 kilometres, were the old shelters where many of the Arno, Dad's family, were living there at that time. And so things, as I said, changed quite dramatically by that late morning, by evening time, or that afternoon as well, and into the evening, where many people at that time in the sand dunes witnessed this black mist rolling towards them. And so it was quite, you could only imagine the fear when people, when families saw this black mist rolling silently towards them through the tops of the trees and along the ground, to this beautiful sand dune country, which the old shelters are still standing today, and you can still see them. So quite a beautiful place, and you can see how people would live in that area there, and they'd walk down from the sand dune to the homestead where they do the domestic work then, and Dad would be, and his fathers would be doing, all the station work then as well. So you know, that day on the 15th of October, you know, things changed. By evening time, people became quite ill from radiation fallout. But it took Dad 30 odd years after Totem 1 before we really got some good answers, or got answers to what took place. And that was because Dad had heard a ABC radio interview with the gentleman by the name of Sir Ernest Titterton, who was on ABC, saying that they had taken good care of the blackfellas. And Dad was listening to this particular interview, and I think it was that interview that really triggered him then to go, hang on a minute, that wasn't the case. At Emu Field, many of us became quite ill, and a lot of the elderly who were quite weak were the ones that really felt the fallout over their traditional lands, and many of them elders had passed. And so we've got a lot of oral history stories of my grandmothers burying their parents, which, you know, you can only imagine how tragic and how traumatizing that experience would have been. And Nana Angelina Wanga spoke about that in part of her testimony as well. So as I said, 30 years later was the time when Dad really got some sort of answers, and that was through the pushing of a royal commission into the British nuclear testing, and that was the McClellan Royal Commission. And through that process, they struggled to prove that the radiation fallout had impact on his blindness, because Dad lost his sight soon after 1953, and it would have been roughly 1957 when Dad might have been 15, 16, because he was born in the bush, so really didn't have a birth date, but, you know, give or take a couple of years. So at that very young age was when his eyesight went on him, and at that age of 16, his world turned into complete darkness then. And I, as a mother of 4, and my youngest son is 17, I get quite overwhelmed with that as well, to think that as that young boy, that's how old Dad was when his world turned into complete darkness. So, you know, he certainly was, I think, dealt the short straw. You know, when you think of Dad, I think of the amazing young man that he would have been working and enjoying on country and being out there in the open with his, you know, family, and working on the pastoral property, and, you know, enjoying being on country and learning his traditional ways and speaking his language and practicing law and culture. And all of a sudden, on, you know, not his blame or not his acts, but because of somebody else's, which is government, of course, who made the decision to conduct those nuclear tests, the Australian government and, of course, the British government. So, you know, it wasn't of Dad's era. But I think that was, after hearing that interview, he was certainly determined then to get some sort of justice and talk about what took place and remember what had taken place as well. And so he pushed very hard for that Royal Commission, and they were very lucky to, you know, be able to give their testimonies, which was really important for, you know, Dad to be able to talk about what happened back then on the 15th of October 1953, but he also made it happen that McClelland was able to be on country, who was the commissioner, made the effort to come to Wallatina, to Walladjara, and take the evidence from Anangu at that time, and to hear, you know, their stories and their recollections. And so, you know, Nana's testimony spoke about a really strong smell, like a toxic smell. Nana Gumbwater spoke about skin rashes and sore eyes and, you know, strong smell and just feeling of this thickness that fell over, which was later in that Royal Commission they found out was radiation fallout over Wallatina. And so when you have a lived experience, and, you know, as people would know, I'm a second generation survivor of those British nuclear tests, you feel that you have a obligation, and I think Dad did back in the day, of really talking about this nuclear injustice and, you know, voices not being heard and the way that they treated Anangu, because, you know, we were so isolated and we didn't have access to any medical services. We were hundreds of kilometres away from Ernabella Mission, where probably the mission had a doctor that may have been able to see. We're roughly 200 kilometres west of Yankunytjatjara, so we would have had to travel 200 kilometres east to get to Yankunytjatjara, which is where the railway line was, to then try and get to maybe down to south, Port Augusta way, to get any sort of medical attention. So very isolating, and no real access to any services, and especially medical services, soon after that radiation fallout over community and over Dad's traditional lands. So people were really, you know, really badly done by, because elders passed, Dad started to experience the sore eyes, and then at that young age, his world turned into complete darkness. So, and through that Royal Commission process, we could only prove, or Dad could only prove, that it was radiation fallout. And that Wallatina had the highest radiation fallout from that first test, that first mainland test. So, you know, this is a story that's been with us for decades now, and it's kind of moved into other areas and, you know, other issues that are being raised because of nuclear, whether it's nuclear waste dumps, and that's where Nana Gumbawatta mob came heavily involved in the time in the Gulbabiri Gungayuda, and then Howard government was pushing for a nuclear waste dump, and so Nana mob got in quite active and you know, vocal and concerned, because it was part of their cultural responsibility and looking after country as well. And they had knowledge, great knowledge of country, and they were very concerned and very worried about waste dump and what that might have impact wise on community and on their lands, on their traditional lands. And so, you know, they formed back in the late 90s, 98, the Gulbabiri Gungayuda, who really led a solid campaign then against the Howard government to, you know, block the waste dump. But then, you know, fast track a couple of years, we were dealing with another push for a waste dump issue as well, which would have been our state government in South Australia, and it was under the Jay Weatherill leadership. He was our premier at the time, but he was also pushing for a Royal Commission into the nuclear fuel cycle, which is where I came quite active then in that work. I kind of helped Nana in the Wendy campaign to get Nana's voice out, and that was part of the role that I saw my father play as well, in being the bridge between, you know, commissioners and lawyers and understanding the legal process, and then was able to interpret to Yankunytjatjara and get Yankunytjatjara on side, his people on side, to be able to speak in Yankunytjatjara, Bijanjara, and then share those stories as well. So he played this role of communicator between two cultures, and I took that role on in the Wendy campaign with Nana Gumbawatta mob, and, you know, played that role, and then stepped into this Royal Commission role. And, you know, I remember my late sister, Rose Lester, who said to me, "Sis, I don't think I've got the energy to fight this one." And I said, "Look, I think we just need a tag team." And, you know, this hasn't been a job that we want to take on. We've got other things happening. We've mothers we are, and we're raising our children, but these things came up, and that was one of the heavy tasks for both my sister and I, where, you know, we had to be actively involved against the Royal Commission into the nuclear fuel cycle, and people like Jim was heavily involved supporting us as well. And we really worked hard and formed networks, and build good working relationships with the unions and education unions and other Aboriginal groups as well in South Australia. But the main thing was that we were there, as in the Indigenous voice, and our Aboriginal voices of South Australia were there at the very beginning of that whole Royal Commission. But we had to push our way through, and that's the role that I kind of played in trying to get in there to say, hang on a minute, Aboriginal voices are so important in this Royal Commission and you need to hear us, and we are part of this conversation. And, I was able to get Aboriginal people of South Australia involved, and we were able to, be right there front and centre in the whole process. And, sharing crazy experiences I did with my sister, my late sister, and then a cousin of ours as well. And funny, overwhelming experiences, and we called it speed dating, but we were giving evidence of the reasons why Aboriginal people of South Australia say no, and to share our personal story to 100 jurors each, because there was 300 jurors who were in this whole Royal Commission process through Democracy Co. And we each had 100 jurors to, again, tell our stories as we rotated around. So these were really overwhelming experiences that, my cousin actually wrote a paper about it as well, about the process. Not very many Aboriginal people, and especially countrymen, like, my grandparents and then possibly even Dad wouldn't, feel comfortable in a space like that to go around with 10 jurors in groups of 10, so 100 jurors, to talk about the reasons why. It's such a uneven playing field. But gratefully, for my sister, my older sister, and then also our cousin, we were successful in actually sharing our stories and participated in this process. So that was the Royal Commission into the nuclear fuel cycle. And then, of course, over the years, the waste dump kept coming back to South Australia, and we've needed to support one another as well. And as some of you, and I'm sure you all know, that there was the Kimber waste dump issue that went down, and they were successful. But again, it was a court process. And so, again, taking people's time and energy and, bringing up the trauma again and talking. And the role that we played was to stand in solidarity with the Bungalow community and, their Aboriginal corporation, and to really say, look, you do have the support of Aboriginal groups of South Australia as well, as you do your struggles through, a legal process. So, they were successful, and we were very pleased with that as well, and the outcome of that court case as well. But of course, as we all know, and what's on the table now is the talk of nuclear power plants. And I had come back from Baku, November last year. I'd travelled over there for the climate conference. Climate change conference, and that was around November. And soon after coming back from there, I was a witness to the inquiry that was run by the Commonwealth Government around the nuclear fuel cycle. And I think I was kind of exhausted from Baku, because that was such an overwhelming experience being over there. And there was a delegation of Aboriginal women who were kind of involved in this process, supported by Get Up, the organisation, who really brought this amazing delegation of Aboriginal women from, across Australia, who were really concerned about climate. And of course, I, said, this is my story. I'm coming in with this, need to stand up and talk about the impacts of nuclear testing in, our country, on our Yankunytjatjara country. And I was an affected community. And so we really campaigned. And I travelled across over there with Dave Sweeney, who's a part of ACF, Australian Conservation Foundation. And both he and I went across there to really voice our concerns around the nuclear issue and this debate that's on the table now about nuclear power, which we're all discussing now. So we went there, and what was overwhelming was those pro-nukers were actually given time and space to talk up about nuclear power being the solution to climate change. That was quite overwhelming because we, as those who coming from affected communities, were quite overwhelmed by the fact that these pro-nukers were given airtime, and that space was quite challenging because many people were, you know, hearing that side of the story, and David actually tried to spend time and listen in that area and to kind of understand where they're coming from, and then also, you know, knowing the stories of what us as Aboriginal people and you know, those that are affected communities globally, and our stories that we share all the time of the trauma and the loss. You know, how do you try and find some sort of balance in there? That was overwhelming. I was fortunate enough to do some press, that was press conferences, so that was a good opportunity to sort of speak up more about myself as from representing impacted communities in South Australia. And then, you know, that was a good experience. But then I came back, and then I evidence in the Royal Commission, or not what Royal Commission, it was the inquiry then after I got back from Baku around the reasons why Aboriginal people, you know, have said no and always will say no around nuclear and nuclear power. And so, you know, I was fairly strong because I'd come back from Baku, and I think I was exhausted from that experience, and then I was ready to kind of say, look, we're not interested as Aboriginal people, and we are the most consulted people, and still you are not hearing. We have gone through processes over the decades when you look back at that timeline, you know, the reasons why. Dad's Royal Commission, Nana's campaign against the Iradiwandi, the waste dump, the Royal Commission into the nuclear fuel cycle, and we were successful. And we were blocking waste dumps and speaking up about the Royal Commissions and, you know, why we say no to nuclear. And that was what I thought, you know, you're not listening, and this idea of nuclear power is not the solution to climate change. And so I gave that evidence to that. And that was you know, a good opportunity. And then, of course, recently I've just come back from the third meeting of the states parties, speaking up again with affected communities and us as communities globally networking around, you know, this issue on making sure that our voices are front and centre in this whole debate around the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and pushing my country, Australia, to sign and ratify this treaty as well. So, you know, a lot of work happening, but this is not my daytime job. You know, this is a personal thing that I've kind of stepped into in honour of my late father, Yami Lester, and the legacy that he's left, who spoke up about, you know, the harms of nuclear testing in our Yankunytjatjara country. So, you know, it's a generational story now, and I can say that because I'm a mother of 4. And this is a story that they need to take on as well. And I was very lucky to take my youngest son, William, with me to New York for him to sort of see how the whole UN and this important work around the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is really important. And he met a lot of people over there, especially from affected communities, which was overwhelming and you know, important for me as a mother to make sure that he knows what happens, but knows his story, and hopefully one day can continue on as the next generation. Or if we are successful and Australia signs on the treaty, then, you know, he doesn't have to be too active in the space as I have been over the decades now. So, you know, hopefully I haven't gone over time, but thank you, Monique, and thank you for the invite to just share a little bit of our story. You know, as a second generation survivor of the British nuclear tests.
No, thank you so much, Karina. Yeah, we won't probably have time for any questions, but I think it was so important to hear all of the work that you're doing and your story. And I think for us in Far North Queensland, I think there is, you know, this discussion of, you know, with the renewable energy transition starting up here or having been rolled out, that nuclear is being proposed as this alternative to avoid the destruction from renewables. But we know that it's so, like, we can't use a silver bullet solution, and it's so powerful to hear your story, and that, you know, we need to be making sure renewables are done right. But yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, please, yeah, we'll open the chat back up for folks to share any reflections, but yeah, we won't have time for people to share, but really appreciate, yeah, you sharing, Karina.
Thank
Thanks so-
you.
Oh yes, I'm introducing our next speaker as well. So yeah, please share your thoughts and reflections while I introduce Jim. So our next speaker is Dr. Jim Green. I'll just get that spotlight. Yeah, Jim Green, he is the National Nuclear Campaigner with Friends of the Earth, and a member of the Nuclear Consulting Group, and is a former editor of the World. Just move this over here so I can read it and look at you guys. Of the World Information Service on Energy's Nuclear Monitor publication. He has an honours degree in public health and a doctorate in science and technology studies, and he'll be talking about the links between nuclear power and nuclear weapons proliferation. Thank you so much, Jim, for being here. I'll get Sam to spotlight Jim so we can see his face, and I'll hand over.
Thanks very much, Monique. Is my screen sharing working?
Yes, it is. I believe I can see it, so hopefully everyone else can.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for being here, everyone. So I'm going to quickly run through the three different categories of nuclear risks that Peter Dutton wants to impose on us. Catastrophic accidents, weapons proliferation, and attacks on nuclear plants. So the Nuclear Plume Project, which was released yesterday, it answers this question: how would a nuclear disaster affect communities around the 7 sites targeted for nuclear reactors by the Dutton Coalition? You can see the website up there, nuclearplume.au. And what we've done is we've taken a Fukushima fallout map of cesium-137, which was arguably the most significant radioactive contaminant, but certainly not the only one. The first thing you'll notice there is that's Melbourne at the centre of that map, and this is assuming a nuclear disaster at the Loy Yang site, which is one of the 7 sites being targeted by the coalition. So obviously, nuclear radiation can spread over vast distances. When you're talking about the most far-flung distances, which receive some radioactive fallout, the doses were low, the risks were low, but the risks are never zero. And of course, when we start to zoom in, as we do in this next map, to an 80-kilometre radius, there's a couple of points to note here. First is that after the Fukushima disaster, the US government recommended all US citizens within 80 kilometres to evacuate. And also the Federal Parliamentary Research Library put out some research last year showing that 12,000 farms exist within a 30k radius, an 80k radius of these 7 sites. And a joint ministerial statement from the federal government and the agriculture ministers of the 7 mainland states and territories noted that in similar countries such as the US, states have detailed plans to manage radioactive emergencies from reactors within a similar radius of farmland. So we're going to zoom in just a little bit further again to a 30k radius. After the Fukushima and Chernobyl disasters, evacuation zones extended beyond 30k's. But for our project, we use a 30k radius. And after Fukushima, there were 191,000 people evacuated. And after Chernobyl, it was 350,000. So we've assumed a 30k evacuation zone, and we've found that nearly 200,000 people live at these within 30k's of the 7 proposed reactor sites combined. So if we scroll down to the Queensland sites, it's over 21,000
near within 30 k's of the Tarong site and over nearly 8,000 near the Collide site. Also, there are 33 hospitals and medical centres across these 7 sites within 30 k's, 99 schools, 62 daycare centres. Just a few comments on the economics of nuclear disasters. The first one is, well, the costs are astronomical. For Chernobyl and Fukushima, they're basically trillion-dollar disasters. And if that were to happen in Australia, it would equate to $40,000 for every Australian citizen. Reactor suppliers will not accept liability for the damage caused by their reactors. It's one of the really huge problems of the nuclear industry, and no one's even trying to resolve it. On the contrary, they're moving in the other direction. Housing prices have been shown to fall due to proximity to nuclear plants. And of course, property prices are drastically affected by disasters. And policies for many of Australia's major insurers contain specific text excluding coverage for nuclear disasters. So they won't insure homes, cars or possessions against a nuclear accident or release. Onto the second set of risks. Nuclear power and weapons proliferation. 5 of the 10 countries that produce nuclear weapons did so under cover of a peaceful nuclear program. Australia pursued nuclear power as a stepping stone to nuclear weapons, and that's a really fascinating story, but I don't have time to go into it. If you want to read about it, look up the Jervis Bay Nuclear Power Project, because that was the height of this interest in using power as a stepping stone to weapons. And there's been an incredible turnaround in industry rhetoric since 2017. They used to deny the connections between nuclear power and weapons, but now they acknowledge and celebrate those connections, and they argue that the nuclear power industry needs even more taxpayer subsidies so it can play this role of supporting weapons programs. Al Gore summed it up very neatly some years ago. He said, for 8 years in the White House, every weapons proliferation problem we dealt with was connected to a civilian reactor program. So now I'm going to move on to another set of risks. Attacks on nuclear plants. There have been quite a number of examples of nation states attacking nuclear plants using conventional weaponry. 1981, Israel destroyed a research reactor in Iraq because they feared it was going to be used for weapons production. 10 years later, the US destroyed the same nuclear site for the same reason. But quite a bunch of other examples. But by far the most important is the one that's unfolding as we speak, which is in Ukraine, where multiple nuclear sites have been struck by conventional military weaponry since the war began in 2 years and 1 month ago. That includes nuclear power reactors. We had the seizure of the Zaporizhia site and the seizure of the closed Chernobyl site, but also nuclear waste stores and dumps have been hit, and nuclear research centres and so on. So we're not just talking about hypothetical risks here. In relation to Russia, the International Atomic Energy said in a 2023 report that every one of their 7 indispensable pillars for ensuring nuclear safety and security in an armed conflict have been breached. I won't read all those 7 categories, but you can check out that report yourself. And probably arguably the most disturbing thing is that the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is the biggest in Ukraine and the biggest in Europe, has repeatedly lost off-site power. And when that happens, you're relying on emergency generators for the power to cool the reactor. But they've repeatedly lost off-site power, and they've put themselves significantly closer to a situation where nuclear meltdowns could happen and nuclear disasters such as Fukushima. This issue of security has been addressed just recently by a group called Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. And they warned that the plan to build reactors would leave Australia vulnerable to missile warfare and sabotage. And retired Admiral Chris Barry, the former chief of the Australian Defence Force, said, every nuclear power facility is a potential dirty bomb because rupture of containment facilities can cause devastating damage. Modern warfare is increasingly focused on missiles and uncrewed aerial systems, and with the proposed power stations all located within 100 kilometres of the coast, they are a clear and accessible target. And another member of the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group is Cheryl Durant, a former DoD director, and she said in the Ukraine-Russia war, both sides are given strategic priority to targeting their opponents' energy systems, and Australia would be no different. So these nuclear facilities would necessitate expensive and complex missile defence systems, as well as allocated cyber and counterintelligence resources, making our security challenge more complex and more expensive. So I'll leave it there with that brief overview of 3 sets of problems: nuclear accidents, weapons proliferation, and security risks. There's lots more information on those issues and many others at those 3 websites. If anyone wants to email me, you're very welcome to. If you want a copy of this PowerPoint, just send me an email and I'll send it to you. And I will hand it back to you, Monique and Margie.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jim. I'd love to open it up if folks have any questions. I'll make sure I can see your faces. Yeah, does anyone have any questions or reflections after that presentation from Jim? Thank you. It was so good. Go ahead, Margie.
Yeah, look, Jim, I have, I cannot see anything that makes sense in this whole picture, except this idea that the nuclear industry needs a waste dump to continue the nuclear industry, and that Australia has been named as that waste dump for 40 years. And just interested in your comments on that, because I think once we understand the role of Australia in the nuclear industry's waste dump trajectory, which is a 30 or 40 year trajectory, everything else seems to make more sense to me. It all sort of goes, oh, they need an Australian product to make an Australian waste dump. And so I'm just interested in your comments on that.
Well, that's one of the things that's going on. It would be helpful for the nuclear industry worldwide if they could dump their waste in Australia, and that would help them to build new reactors and get public approval and so on. But there's a whole lot of other agendas going on as well, and just narrowly in terms of Australian energy policy, we've got the coalition just love coal and gas, and they hate renewables. And, this is seen as a bit of a deflection. The centrepiece of Dutton's energy plan, and probably the only part that really gets any traction, is that they can and they will expand and prolong the use of fossil fuels, and they can and they will thwart the growth of renewables and EVs and batteries and so on. There's also the weapons agenda. Historically, Australia's one and only serious push for weapons was definitely underpinned by a weapons agenda. The Prime Minister of the day was John Gorton, and he later acknowledged quite bluntly that there was a weapons agenda. But, we can speculate about whether there's a weapons agenda now. I think probably not, but that doesn't mean there won't be a weapons agenda 5 or 10 years down the track. And even if there's no agenda, expanding our nuclear industry brings us closer to a weapons capability, whether we like it or not. And neighbours and adversaries will take close note of that. But I will stop there.
Any other reflections, things that were new to people or had heard before?
There's a really interesting comment in the chat. Could you comment on that, Jim, in relation to small and medium nuclear reactors?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if we look at a company like Westinghouse, it's got more involvement in the nuclear industry than any other company. It was right there at the beginning of the industry. So just to look at their recent experience, they started building a large reactor in South Carolina in the US, abandoned that project after 14 billion Australian dollars was wasted on it. and then declared bankruptcy. So Westinghouse definitely not doing well with large reactors. They designed a mid-sized reactor with a capacity of 600 megawatts, but there was no market for it. So they just gave up on it without building any mid-sized reactors. And they jump in and out of this whole small modular reactor or SMR sector, but they only jump in when there are taxpayer grants available in the US or the UK or elsewhere. But, you know, they haven't built any. They're not building any. There was one company in the US that was quite advanced, but as the project got more advanced, they had to come up with more and more credible cost estimates. And the latest cost estimate was absurd. It was, well, I don't know if this number means anything to you, but $31 billion per gigawatt or $31,000 per kilowatt. It's insanely expensive. And so that NuScale project was abandoned 18 months ago. And just one final point is Peter Dutton's nuclear policy was entirely based around these non-existent SMRs until NuScale abandoned its project in the US 18 months ago. And it was only then that they pivoted to large reactors. Peter Dutton had previously said that he's opposed to large reactors. But just one final comment on SMRs. They basically don't exist. If you use a very loose definition, then there's one in China and one in Russia, but they're not really SMRs. So basically they don't exist.
Thanks, Maeve, for drawing attention to that question. Yeah, Margie, did you want to?
Yeah, I'd just like to talk about, you know, just to raise the sort of issue of intellectual property, so that even if they did exist, there would be a question about whether, say, one from China was allowed to come to Australia, or one from, you know, in like a US non-approved country, a country not approved by the US, would be allowed to be travelled into Australia. So it would have to be a US approved something of that type, I would imagine. Because the US just doesn't allow intellectual property to move around the world, you know, randomly, actually. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, is there any other last questions? I saw Simon's comment in the chat, I guess talking about the cost of like early technology costing more and then it going down. Do you have any comment, Jim, on that versus renewables?
Well, first to give the numbers, in the US, the UK and France, the reactors they're building in those three countries, the cost range is $27 to $46 billion per reactor. Those cost estimates are roughly 10 times higher than the early cost estimates. But with respect to first-of-a-kind reactors and Simon's point that they would become cheaper over time, well, in some countries that has happened, but in other countries, and the US and the France are clear examples, nuclear power has become more expensive, not less expensive. It has a negative learning curve. And unfortunately for the proponents of nuclear power, these spectacular cost escalations have happened at the same time that the costs of renewables have plummeted. So solar PV is about 1/10 the cost of what it was 10 to 15 years ago. Wind power is down 70%. The cost of batteries is coming down sharply. So it's basically priced itself out of the market. And, you know, at the end of the day, we just look at what's happening around the world. Last year, there was 4 gigawatts of new nuclear power compared to 666 gigawatts of new renewable energy capacity. So that's a ratio of 155 to 1. And even in China, which is the only country with a significant nuclear power expansion program, the ratio of renewables to nuclear capacity additions last year was 100 to 1.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, and thank you for answering all those questions. That's at time, so I'll pass back to Margie to introduce our next speaker. But yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jim. And yeah, it's good. I think one of the ideas here is that we just help people become a little bit confident about these stats. But as we know, so people don't really respond to stats when listening to things. People people respond to relationships and the feel and the vibe. But this is just to provide a foundation to know that you are on the right, you're on the right track, or to realize that some of this is quite contested. So I would like to now pass to Wendy Farmer, who's a community campaigner at Yes to Renewables, which is a Friends of the Earth campaign, or a set of campaigns. And she's president of the Latrobe Valley Community Group Voices of the Valley. Latrobe Valley has been a big producer of power, of coal-fired power in the past, but a lot of those coal-fired powered plants have been shutting down because they've aged. The Latrobe Valley is one of the proposed sites for nuclear power reactors, which would replace the Loy Yang coal power station. And she's going to talk about those sorts of local and regional perspectives that they're encountering as they start to campaign and explore with communities about these issues. So welcome, Wendy.
And thank you for inviting me. I might just get my camera up a little bit there. Yeah, so as it was said, I'm from Latrobe Valley, and I really started campaigning in 2014. Latrobe Valley population is about 125,000 people. We're 2 hours east of Melbourne, and for over a century, Latrobe Valley has actually produced Victoria's power and has made Victoria and other states what they are. In the early or late 80s, early 90s, the SEC, so State Electricity Commission of Victoria, had owned the power stations, and in the 1989, they were sold to private companies. We lost 75% of the jobs in the power station. But what we saw in the loss of those jobs was a community really suffering, a community hurting. Needless to say, economic and social impacts of privatisation was devastating for our community. Many left the area and many worked again. And I just want to take 2 steps back right now and acknowledge that I'm calling in from Yankunytjatjara country, the beautiful Yankunytjatjara country, and pay my respects to elders past and present who have protected our country. And we can work together to make sure that continues. Over the years, the region has been promised lots of different jobs. Our saviour will come in with thousands and thousands of jobs. We'll have a new coal to oil, a coal to fuel, a coal to whatever. We will have new power industries, and we've seen nothing. We've seen lots of money go to private companies, but we've seen nothing. Over the last few years, we've seen a massive change. Our hope, jobs, and that's in renewable energy. Over $40 billion in proposed projects across Gippsland. Think about that. But not only the hope in those jobs, but we then bring into the hope of the outflow of those jobs into manufacturing and other opportunities for our community. Our kids have finally got a hope. Last year, we get a media announcement that Peter Dutton has announced that our sites and our power stations are closing. The dates have been announced. So Peter Dutton comes in and says, guess what? We're going to put nuclear reactors into your communities. One of the things of communities like mine is they've gone through lots of different things. Coal communities have really been used in many ways. In 2014, we had a Hazelwood mine fire, a fire that burnt for 45 days. Think about it, sitting around a fire, an open fire out in the bush, and that smoke comes into your face. What do? You get up and you move away. Our community couldn't do that. In fact, a week later, my daughter came down from Melbourne and said to me, oh, this is so bad. How can you breathe it? I said, it's not that bad. We had got used to what we were breathing. our babies had got used to what was we were breathing. And we saw the community stand up and fight. The governments ignored our communities. We were calling for help. We were calling it a disaster in the valley. We need help. But our governments didn't come. It was the people that stood up. Hey, the Hazelwood operators were charged. 22 charges were laid against the company. It was the biggest case that our Environment Protection Authority and WorkSafe had made, because community stood up and forced that there was a court case. They had done the wrong thing. They knew there was a risk. Let's think about this. They knew there was a risk, but they did nothing about it. They hoped for the best. Why would we trust a nuclear company to actually, to protect our community? We can't. You can never say there's no risk. Our community, because of coal, has already paid that health risk. Massive amounts of asbestos, respiratory disease, you name it, cancers. We have high rates of them. Coal communities have high rates. It's time for change, and there's opportunities for communities. In that announcement, Dutton announced the 7 sites. He announced Loy Yang A. Well, funnily enough, I'd been speaking to the operators and owners of all the mines and power stations around here. I knew their closure dates. I knew their plans. And the 3 companies together in a public room had said nuclear is not suitable for our sites. And we don't want nuclear, because we've got plans for our own mines, and that's in renewable energy. We have plans for our own mines. In that announcement made on that morning, Peter Dutton or nobody in the National Party had spoken to the mine operators or owners of the sites, councils, First Nations people, communities, or even state governments. They had not spoken to them. Within hours, we hear from the coalition, well, if they don't want to sell their property, we will compulsory acquire it. Think about it. So they haven't even knocked on the door and said, can I buy your property? They're now saying we will compulsory acquire it. Not much longer. And they said, we will overrule the states. We're bigger than them. We can overrule the states. These states have bans on nuclear energy. We will overrule the states. But then they came out and said, we will talk to these communities for 2.5 years. We'll discuss nuclear. We'll tell them about the benefits. But if they don't want it, we will put nuclear on those sites anyway. So what would be the point of community consultation? But even further, those communities will have no right to veto. They will not have a say. I was flabbergasted, and over those days we had so many different announcements like this, and I'm like, hang on, aren't we in Australia? How can this be? And once again, like the Hazelwood mine fire, when our community was suffering and dying, our community is standing up. Our community is saying we will not accept nuclear and you will not do it to us. We will get angry, but we will use that anger for good. And I think sometimes when we hear these announcements, when we look at this nuclear story, we need to get angry. We actually should be getting furious. We should be telling our friends what our coalition government are saying, because they've also said that the country will actually decide. When we go to election, if we win, that will be a referendum to say that they want nuclear, not the communities or the regions. One of the things what we've done since then is actually join the 7 regions in an alliance to work together. Because what's really important to me and what's really important to those 7 regions is none of us are sacrificed. None of the regions should be sacrificed. No community should be sacrificed. We need all the communities standing together, being strong together and saying no to nuclear. So we have the alliance, and I'm going to ask everybody to actually sign the petition to say support that community and say no to nuclear. I've just put the link in the chat. I think what this is about, though, when we actually start looking into it, this is to stop renewable energy. You know, we're in discussions with a lot of these companies that are actually looking at renewable energy. And, you know, because we actually work with them to make sure that it works for our communities, that renewable energy works for our communities. Sometimes we don't get everything we want, but we can actually help model what needs to happen. And I think what's different in this debate is coal communities have been a power source, but energy is changing. Energy is becoming distributed. Energy actually changes the way that we actually look at our cost of energy, because we can produce it ourselves at home. We can produce it in our communities and get community benefits, and we will have the larger industries to support that. If we had nuclear power stations, or sorry, nuclear reactors, say for Queensland, there's two sites proposed in Queensland. If one goes off, Queensland's going to notice that a power station goes off. If both go off, guess what? You have no power. In Victoria, we have one power station. We've proposed one nuclear power station or reactors. If that goes off, guess what? We have no power. With distributed energy, if we actually have renewable energy running in our communities, if a wind farm goes off, a solar farm isn't working, or our home isn't working, we have energy, and it's still cheap because we produce it ourselves. You know, and I think that's the exciting part of renewable energy. But the nuclear industry don't like that. Hi, everybody from the nuclear industry on this call, but they don't want it, because where is the money then? The money goes into our communities, not into their hands. And we know that there's, you know, a whole web of who is actually controlling the story behind this. I really want to encourage people to get involved with the 2 communities in Queensland that are actually going through this at the moment. Find out how you can support them. Don't go in and do to the community what you think needs to be done. Reach out to me. I'll put you in contact with somebody in the community. Work with those communities, support those communities. And when we go to the election, make sure we say no. Remember, you get angry, get furious, but use that anger for good, because together we make change. Our communities proved it. And Australia can prove that together we will make this change that is needed, and we will all say no to nuclear.
Thank you so much, Wendy. That is awesome. It's the community's perspective, Karina's perspective, and your perspective on what actually really happens to communities is so important. And there is also this other, you know, like one of the things that people in North Queensland are very, very passionate about is the biodiversity issue, and it's their being overridden in biodiversity issue that's made people sort of start even thinking about nuclear. Like, it's one of the things that sparked people off about thinking, because, you know, cassowaries are very important to people, and koalas, and, you know, the yellow wallaby, you know, there's these animals that are very important, and these ecosystems that are very important. And so we in North Queensland know what it means to be really passionate about biodiversity, and that's the thing that's really important to us, you know, maybe even more than jobs or something like that, you know. And so you know, to hear these stories about this, how communities are overridden, is so important to us. And because we know in North Queensland what it means to have our voices overridden. You know, we're overridden over and over, and have very little representation in the South. And so it seems to me, it reminds me of the Wild Rivers, actually, you know, this idea that somehow these promises are going to actually create what the community wants, when there's no examples of those governments coming in and creating what the community wants. So I wouldn't be trusting nuclear power company as far as I could throw them, which wouldn't be very far. So anyway, thank you so much. What's that?
Can I just respond to that?
Yes.
Because when the pro-nuclear people had the first meeting in Morwell, It was actually after a little bit of a challenge. Robert Parker from Nuclear for Climate Australia actually admitted that nuclear would do nothing for climate change for 60 years. You know what? That's too late. I actually have a recording of him saying that you know, nuclear will do nothing for 60 years to address climate change. For our community, Loy Yang A would be the last power station to operate. So I don't even know how they would work out how they could build nuclear reactors there when, you know, the power station would still need to operate. And if it's not operating, we wouldn't need nuclear because we would have enough distributed energy elsewhere. So 2035 is the closure date. So we wouldn't have jobs or any action on climate change because we would have to keep power stations open, but they're that old that they'd probably cause a risk anyway. They'd probably cause a disaster anyway. I just want to broach another thing that I didn't say. 14 years ago, Fukushima happened. There was a known risks with nuclear back then. Those people haven't been able to return home. Think about it. All of a sudden you get a call to get out. Flee, go wherever you can, as far away as you can. You know, just leave your home, leave everything, leave Johnny's teddy bear, just leave everything. They've never been able to return. I don't think, you know, renewable energy, the way we do it now, is like completely everything. It will continue to change. Our mobile phone was a phone that made calls. It then became a small little computer, and now it's something we carry in our pocket. And every time something new becomes on it, we get something else new because some smart ass goes, we can do better. Renewable energy will be like that. Let's work to make sure that it happens for our communities.
So I'm also interested in does other people have got any reflections about the meaning of this for remote areas? North Queensland's very remote. What it means for communities that don't get listened to. Has anybody had experience of not being listened to by by governments in remote areas before? And yeah, any thoughts on some of the things that Wendy's, or just even what resonated with you, I think is really the question here. What resonates with you? Because it's, while the Latrobe Valley is not as remote as North Queensland, it's still a rural regional community. Anybody got their hand up? Just use your little react sign there. I think one of the things that strikes me often when I think about this issue is how difficult it is for me in Cairns to find somebody to fix my roof or even fix my solar panels on my roof. And I wonder how, you know, how it is that they think they're going to find engineers in these remote locations to live and look after these, you know, very complex, very, very complex technologies. And I know engineers think they can do anything, but, you know, if you're in 100,000-year project or even a 200-year or 500-year project, you know, I'm not quite sure that we'll have engineers available as we move through 500 years in the colony. It seems to me that those engineers are currently not available, and they won't be available at the time that you need them when there's a pandemic or starvation or some other trauma going on that might go for 20, 30 years. There may be a dip in the availability of engineers, and you've got this incredibly complex nuclear thing that's incredibly dangerous, and you know, how do you respond? You know, in North Queensland, I know the people who live in North Queensland know what I mean, right? It's sometimes hard to get someone who's got any skills to fix your downpipe, you know. If you know, do people agree with me? Like those of you who have lived in Karanda, you know what it can be like. You can't find someone to remove the mold off your walls, sort of thing.
There's just a question from Pat. Wendy, how are people responding to the nuclear plume maps in the Latrobe Valley?
It's been really interesting. We have our local national member sort of saying that we want an adult discussion and we don't want a fear campaign. Although he won't answer any questions. So if we ask him about water, or we ask him about stability of the mines, or if we ask him about anything, he won't answer. So we've got, you know, some people that think that nuclear would be a great idea, and they will spam every page that we can get at, a bit like Simon right now. You know, and so it is a mixed thing. Our communities, regional communities, want jobs and they want hope. Right now, we have jobs in renewable energy and we have the hope because we've got those jobs. Remember, I said so many workers were displaced early. Regional communities are struggling. This is an opportunity for every regional community to be part of the renewable energy system. And, you know, as Margie said, we've already got jobs there. This is about the coalition actually stopping the jobs we have. The jobs we have right now to look at some sort of fantasy that they're dreamt up in the middle of the night, maybe in the shower, who knows?
Yeah, any others? I think now's the time just to sort of broaden it out to this sort of more sort of generalized comment about Far North Queensland and what you've heard from that. We've had the 4 speakers. We've had and actually maybe I'm passing over to Monique here. I think I am. Here we go, Monique.
Yeah, thanks, Margie. But yeah, continue with Margie said, yeah, I think, you know, we wanted this to be a space for us to then reflect on as people living in across Far North Queensland, like what are the reflections after hearing all of that, hearing from Dr. Jim, from Wendy, from Karina, and from Margaret. Yeah, are there thoughts across all of it? Thanks, Alison. Yeah, interesting to hear the speakers, especially the real life examples, what happens to communities. And the other question I wanted people to think about was just like, what else do you need to know or like need to feel confident having these conversations in Far North Queensland about nuclear and about renewables, and yeah. Comment from Wendy, yeah, unfortunately there's been a campaign from fossil fuel sector to spread disinformation about renewable energy. Shame there wasn't anyone with nuclear training in the speakers. Thanks, Simon.
What about those of you who have grown up in Far North Queensland? What are you thinking, and what have you noticed, you know, as those of you who have grown up there or lived there for a long time?
Even what you've been hearing in your community, I think it's good for us to all share, like, what are the positions people are having? What are people feeling about energy? Are people talking about energy in your circles? Feel free to just take yourself off mute at this point, I think, if you want to. Everyone's gone quiet on us.
One thing I notice, which is interesting, is that there's also been a lot of people who grew up in the UK, in Britain or Wales or Ireland, and especially Britain and Wales and Scotland, and who grew up with nuclear power burgeoning in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And there was a big movement then. And also in Australia, there was a big movement against nuclear power. So yeah, I noticed there's a group of older people who know a lot about this. Is this, you know, Margaret, maybe you'd like to speak about this, but there's a lot of knowledge from an older group, and younger people don't seem like what happened there between the old crew and the younger people understanding about these issues.
A big question. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis was certainly something that gave people food for thought about nuclear weapons and nuclear what a nuclear explosion does to the world. I think also we've seen the 3 Mile Islands, we've seen the Chernobyls, we've seen the Fukushimas. I went over to Japan just after the Fukushima accident, and people think because you can't see radiation, if you ignore it, it'll be okay. I mean, in Japan, they were selling fish with so much radiation in it that Greenpeace had to go in, and the only thing that made the government take the fish off the shelves was Greenpeace handing out supermarket flyers that instead of saying you get, 10 kilo, a kilogram of fish for $1, you got 20 becquerels of radiation for $1, and labeled the fish with their actual measured radiation doses. So there's a lot, because people, I think you just learn that governments lie, really, and that unless you push them, unless you stick up to, unless you get your own information. For instance, that Greenpeace did the radiation monitoring there. And over again, in fact, in Fukushima, it required citizen and non-government organisations to measure the radiation to actually get the government to act. One of the most contaminated villages took a month to be evacuated, which was just appalling.
M-E. Me. Please.
Yeah, go ahead if you raised your hand. Oh, you're unmuted, but I don't think we can hear you. I'm not sure if you're speaking. Thanks, Pat. See you later.
No, we can't hear you.
Maybe if you want to, chuck it in the chat, perhaps. Sometimes, sound can be tricky.
I'll just say that I was talking to Margie earlier in the year and was telling her about a friend who I really trust, who's very knowledgeable on lots of different topics, and he totally convinced me nuclear was a good idea, and I just had to look up one website on Google to find a whole list of why it's not. But I think after tonight, it's just an absolute no-brainer hearing about the science, the health effects, the firsthand, and also, the hope for communities that are hopefully transitioning and are transitioning as well. So thank you.
Maria, there's a question from Sid in the chat about the nuclear lobby is making hay over Steve Nowakowski's criticisms of the rollout of wind power projects. What's the response of FO FNQ to his stance? I can also speak to, I guess, CAFNEC's sort of stance on this, and that, that we know that we need urgent action on climate change, and that renewables is the way to go, but that we're also very concerned about having renewables in the wrong places. And CAFNEC campaigned really strongly against the Chilumban wind farm because it was just not in the right place, and that was with rainforest reserves. But we don't support this call for no renewables because we believe that, the nuclear lobby and the fossil fuel lobby are using this as a way to delay renewables and prolong fossil fuel, the use of fossil fuels. And that nuclear isn't this silver bullet solution to the issues with managing biodiversity. And I think someone made a great comment in the chat about that, like, there's, it's concerning when people talk about the amount of space, empty space on this continent, and that, it's not actually empty, it's full of biodiversity and communities, but there is land that is already had been cleared or converted, and that is, appropriate places for us to build renewables on land that, has already been disrupted. But Margie or Sarah, from a FO perspective, do you have anything to share?
I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Sarah here, Friends of the Earth, thank you. I think we agree with all that from Monique and CAFNEC stance. We too are concerned about biodiversity and the effect that the terrible planning laws we have, both at a federal and a state level, the inappropriate development we've seen, not just from some renewable projects, but from coal mining, from all types of mining over Australia, from residential developments, commercial developments. We've seen such appalling planning. It's tragic, and we're losing so much biodiversity, and we obviously really care about that. But it's absolutely ridiculous to think that nuclear energy is any kind of solution. So while we welcome and have great respect for all the work that Stephen Nowakowski and others have done to protect biodiversity, we totally don't agree that nuclear power is the answer. We think better planning is. Do you want to add anything, Margie?
Yeah, I think we have got a response to Steve Nowakowski on our website. So you could go there and have a look at that. But you know, we're very strong on biodiversity at Friends of the Earth Fund North Queensland. It's always been central to everything we do, and we have probably a much stronger position on biodiversity than any other organisation. And you know, really the biggest threat to biodiversity in Queensland right now is land clearing for cattle, which has always been what the biggest land clearing issue has been in Queensland. And right now they're clearing more land exponentially than they have in any other previous year. And they're doing that for increasing cattle. They've just bulldozed an entire, or virtually, I can't remember the name of that station that's just southwest of the Tableland there. I remember I visited there a couple of times when I worked for the Flying Doctors, and, you know, had beautiful forest there, and they've just bulldozed it all like that for land clearing. And that's not the only piece of Western Queensland that they have bulldozed. So we are very strong. We are also very concerned. And as I said, you know, Brian worked against that Chulumban-Warri transmission line in the early 1990s, not with much help from anybody, including people from CAFNEC. You know, like he just got attacked by everybody and, you know, chucked under the bus. And I can tell you all these people now who are upset about biodiversity were not there at that time working against those. I mean, some of them were, it's true. But we have a very strong position. We'd like to see a much better position on biodiversity with Aboriginal people really at the centre of that vision, and curating the landscapes, because those landscapes have always been curated by Aboriginal people, and they've always been interacting with those landscapes. And so that those things are very important to us. But we see no place for nuclear in that story. There is no place for nuclear in that story, because I truly believe, I understand this idea about, you know, how good it is to keep the fossil fuel going, but I don't think the fossil fuel industry is paying this money. I think the nuclear industry is behind the money going into the National Party and the LNP. It's nuclear money, not fossil fuels money. That's the nuclear. I've been watching since the beginning of the pandemic, 2020. I've been watching it closely. I watched them to start to roll it out. Month number 1, January 2020, they started a program to push nuclear across the country, and it's coming from the nuclear industry. That was in 2020, it was coming definitely from the nuclear industry, and it was very hard to see who they were, but there was some excellent work done by Crikey. I can't remember his name, one of the Crikey investigative reporters, who looked into, I wrote to him and said, there are nuclear industry wraiths. I don't know who they are. They're sort of invisible, but they're in the background. They're feeding Joyce. They're feeding the National Party. They're, you know, this National Party. These people in North Queensland who are pushing it, they're old National Party people, and they are in bed. They're still got those relationships. If you think of it relationally, they're relationally connected to the old National Party, and these people are getting money to prop up their old party systems from the nuclear industry, not from the coal industry, from the nuclear industry. And that's because the nuclear industry is paying a long game to get a waste dump. And that waste dump is slated for South Australia. Karina's, those people have fought that off 5 times. And of course, there are some fantastic benefits right now for the coal and gas by the nuclear industry putting this money in there, and they're playing it as they can. They've joined that game. But I think once you realise the amount of money that would be involved in a waste dump, you can start to see who the players are. And that in that article by Crikey, he names who those players are. And those players came from Crosby Textor, who were, it was in, you know, you can see it in the AUKUS deal. You can see those General Dynamics. They work for General Dynamics. Crosby Textor works for General Dynamics. General Dynamics is a weapons maker and it's a nuclear maker. It owns one of the uranium mines in South Australia. They are in the centre of this. And people in the coal and gas industry, in the environment movement, they don't understand it. But we at Friends of the Earth, we're in the centre. We're in the centre between the environment movement and the peace movement. And so we can see where those weapons corporations cross over and benefit from both stories. So I just want you to keep an eye out that. You can read those articles in Crikey where he outlines that, you know, what happens at the end of the 90s when they lose, the nuclear industry really starts to lose their contracts, starts to lose their control over the uranium industry. They start to use the nuclear weapons industry. They start to really fight. And then you start to see them making a comeback in the 2020s when they start to pay off the National Party. So just keep an eye out for that sort of politics. Coal and gas is not the only politics in town. Weapons is a politics in town. And we have a huge weapons industry, 50 billion a year right now being paid directly into weapons companies, directly, 50 billion a year directly to weapons companies, irrespective of this money that's being paid from the nuclear industry then back into the National Party and the LNP. You keep your eye on the game, and that's the game. The game is where the big money is coming into the parties to run their campaigns, to pay for their TV advertising. That's where the big money is. And the people like Steve Nowakowski, no clue about that sort of stuff, no clue, right? And these nuclear engineers, they think that their white man brilliance is going to solve the world. Technology is not going to solve the world. What's going to solve is relationships and understanding these more complex political problems. Sorry, that's my little.
Thanks,
Where
Margaret.
far north Queensland FNQ is potentially not, potentially where wage peace is. But anyway, there we are.
Thanks, Margie. I think we're going to wrap it up because it's getting late, but I just wanted to share two places. Well, one place that CAFNEC, we're going to be continuing to hold like workshops, because as someone pointed out earlier, like it's not only having the facts, it's also having the space to think and talk about how you have these kind of conversations. So the first one is on the 1st of April. Sam's just going to chuck them in the chat, the links to the events. 1st of April will be the first one, but we'll have a couple more. So in the next few months, where we'll have it hybrid, so you can join online and in person. We've got a pretty good setup now where it's quite nice to join whether you're online or in person, to have a kind of conversation training workshop talking about energy. And then also I just wanted to shout out for next Wednesday, CAFNEC is co-hosting a LICAT candidates forum. Obviously energy is the big conversation in this federal election. So we've got the candidates for Leichhardt together at Hemingway. So it's a free event and there'll be free pizza if you're in Gimoy, Cairns. Please come down on Wednesday evening, and we'll chuck that in there as well. It should be all in the chat, but also on CAFNEC's website and on Faith's socials. But that was all for me. And if you want to stay in contact with Friends of the Earth Far North Queensland, please send a little message to Sarah Isaacs in the chat. And I really wanted a huge shout out to Sarah Isaacs for coordinating all the speakers. Amazing behind the scenes, and thank you to all our speakers. I think Jim, you're still here, and Wendy, thank you so much. And Margaret, thank you. I think Karina,
thank you so much for coming, everybody. And Monique, yay, thank you, Monique.
Thank you, Margie, great co-facilitator, and thank you everyone for engaging respectfully and sharing perspectives. I know it's really important to hear everyone and have some proper debate about this and sharing the thoughts and getting the thoughts out there. So yeah, we'll hopefully have this published soonish so that people can rewatch if you missed anything and want to come back for it. But yeah, and share it with your friends. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.